What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. I know I'm a little late for this, but with the release of Knock at the Cabin earlier this year, I wanted to stop and rank all 14 of director M Night Shyamalan's movies from worst to best. He actually has 15 movies, with his first film being this indie drama Praying with Anger, but that film also has never seen a wide release or any sort of mainstream distribution. It's almost impossible to find. So I'm not including it for this list, and we're just sticking with everything that came after that. So before we begin, let me know in the comments what's your ranking of M Night Shyamalan's movies. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content like reviews, rankings, and all other sorts of lists. So, let's not waste any more time, and let's jump into this. In last place, After Earth. And while another movie on this list is usually known and criticized for not having any of Shyamalan's usual flair, you can also very much say the same for this movie. This is less of an M. Night Shyamalan movie and more of a Will Smith vanity project that just happens to be directed by M. Night Shyamalan. He co-wrote it as well, but really this originated from a story idea by Will Smith, so this is still very much more Smith's movie. But that's not solely the reason this movie is where it is. It's here because it's also just not a good movie by any means, unfortunately. Will Smith conceived of this idea as a means to kick off a franchise, which unfortunately did not happen after the reviews. And in this movie, it's in the future, and Earth is now this hazardous place with environmental problems that can kill people, but nothing truly interesting is really done with this concept. This could have been maybe a take on something like the climate crisis, but all we really get is Jaden Smith running through generic forests for most of the movie, while Will Smith is stuck on a ship giving him orders, and we just repeat that for most of the movie. So it's really a missed opportunity, and on top of that, nothing interesting is even done with the generic forest. There aren't any thrilling moments or exciting action set pieces. It's just this dull, repetitive structure of Jaden running around and Will talking to him over an earpiece for the most part. Now, this is a competently made movie. Shyamalan's flair isn't here, but I don't think he doesn't do anything egregiously bad in terms of the aesthetic. So, it would have been watchable, and it would have made its way a few spots higher on this list if it wasn't for the fact that the performances are also just not only bad, but awful. Part of the reason for the casting was so that Will Smith could recreate the magic of the much better Pursuit of Happiness, which also starred his son. But whereas that movie was very emotional, this was totally void of emotion. Both Will and Jaden are bad on their own, and then, shockingly, even worse together, somehow having no chemistry whatsoever here. Both characters are played very one-note, where Will is extremely emotionally distant, while Jaden is robotic and monotone for the entire movie. It's not only very distracting, but because of just how unrealistic they both sound, it undercuts any moment that the film attempts to go for some sort of emotional resonance, and it just leads to a very hollow, sluggish experience that I really did not enjoy. Only just a smidge above that is The Last Airbender, and I don't think there's really much I could say for this in particular, considering this was the scourge of the internet at the time of its release. I'm really not adding anything new to the conversation on this one because it's really just as bad as everyone says it is, so I'll try to keep this brief. This fails both as an adaptation of the show, which I very much enjoy, as well as a story in its own right. It tries condensing an entire season of a TV show into a 100-minute movie, which you just can't do. Any big emotional moment that felt earned in the show just gets brushed along really quick in an exposition-heavy sequence before moving on here. So not only does it isolate anyone who enjoy the show, but because it has to get through so much and doesn't really explain everything in an accessible sort of way, it also alienates anyone who's never seen the show. So that's easily the biggest strike against it. And then just to boot, it fails pretty much on all technical levels. The visuals are unconvincing, the acting's terrible, the dialogue is extremely cringy, and the action scenes lack any sense of creativity to them. Just an absolute hodgepodge of everything that could possibly go wrong. I think the only reason it isn't in dead last is because I do have that appreciation of the original show, so there are some very, very faint sporadic moments here where I could have some appreciation for what they were trying to do here. But even then, it's still very much a stretch. It's otherwise just an absolute misfire on all levels. Number 12, Lady in the Water. Now, unlike the previous two films where I think they're absolutely terrible, I wouldn't say the same thing for this, despite the fact that you generally hear a lot of people put this one on the same level as the previous two movies. Now, I don't think this is a good movie, as you can see by its placement on this list. There are definitely some major issues I had with it, but I'd say it's more of a competently made but misguided swing and a miss. On a technical level, it looks pretty solid, as is the case with most of Shyamalan's other movies, and the performances are all fine for what they are. This isn't Paul Giamatti at his best, but he still goes for it here, and he is watchable, as is Bryce Dallas Howard. And I also appreciate how Shyamalan tried using this as an attempt to deconstruct fairy tales and the fantasy genre as a whole. However, the execution in its attempts at doing so is severely off, and that's generally why a lot of people view this as terrible. And these are the two biggest strikes against this. For one, it's a super dialogue-heavy film, which in and of itself isn't a bad thing. There are plenty of great dialogue-heavy films out there, but Shyamalan, even when at his best, has always struggled with dialogue in his films, which, spoiler alert, you're going to hear me bring up a lot more in this video. And when you have a film like this that's so reliant on dialogue, it comes off as a mix of either cringy or just dull. His attempts at diving deep into the fantasy genre mostly come off as heavy-handed platitudes that don't hook you in or provide any sort of unique spin on the genre. So there's that. And then the other big thing against this is how self-indulgent it can be. I generally don't have a problem with Shyamalan casting himself in his own movies, but here he casts himself as a character who is literally called the most important person in the universe and serves as a key part to the plot. And then our antagonist is a movie critic who is stuck up, generally wrong about everything, and is openly antagonistic, usually without reason. So the film was used as a way for Shyamalan to push back at his own critics, which is fine. It's just that the way it comes off here feels more petty and wince-inducing rather than a clever slapback at them. And when you have these not-so-subtle parallels combined with a main storyline that comes off as dull, it just results in a very misguided effort. Not terrible, it's certainly way more watchable than either The Last Airbender or After Earth, but it's still not good if you ask me. Number 11, Wide Awake. Generally the film people often forget about when it comes to Shyamalan's filmography. A lot of people generally assume The Sixth Sense was his big screen debut, when in actuality, he made this family-friendly dramedy prior to that. And it's an odd film to rank against all these other high-concept genre movies because it's absolutely nothing like any of the other movies in his filmography. But what I will say is this. Despite the stark difference in genre from the rest of Shyamalan's filmography, it does see him tackle themes that would be prevalent in all his later films, like finding meaning in your life, like overcoming grief, and all these religious overtones, with this kid who lost his grandfather reevaluating his religious beliefs. And it results in a mostly harmless and well-intentioned movie. There are a fair amount of amusing moments here and there are various points where it goes to pull on our heartstrings, and it did work for what it was. And I do think as a result, it makes for some nice family-friendly entertainment. However, if you're out of that target audience, I'd say that despite being the black sheep of Shyamalan's filmography, it's still really not a must-see. I'd say this is a fairly inconsistent movie, primarily stemming from Shyamalan struggling with problems that would carry over into the rest of his filmography. For every moment that comes off as heartwarming, there are just as many moments that come off as hokey or unbelievable, usually due to the poorly written dialogue. And then, for every joke that I found amusing, and to be clear, even when that worked, it was never really laugh-out-loud hilarious, there were just as many that fell flat on their face. So the film was ultimately less than the sum of its parts, resulting in a fairly generic movie that was never as insightful as it was looking to be. Like I said, it's ultimately harmless and really not a bad movie, but nothing too memorable at the same time. Bringing us into the top 10 is Glass. Now, when I first saw this movie, I absolutely hated it. I was so excited for it at the time because I really liked both Unbreakable and Split, and I found myself severely let down by this, to the point where I almost felt personally insulted. And upon my most recent rewatch, now that I know what I was getting into, I was able to appreciate a little more about it, I still wouldn't say I ultimately liked it. Like some of the movies lower on this list, it's a very competently made movie. Shyamalan sets his atmosphere well, and the performances are all great. James McAvoy in particular is the big standout for the sheer range he gets to show off with each of his characters' different personalities. And it was cool revisiting the characters from Unbreakable and seeing them cross over with the Split characters in what was essentially a surprise trilogy. However, for all the potential this had, it absolutely squanders it by confining all three of our leads to this psychiatric ward and mostly stripping them of all the things that made them interesting in the first place, with this fairly uninteresting plot point of Sarah Paulson's character trying to convince them that they actually don't have superpowers. Pretty much the total opposite of what we were looking for when going into this. And then, to go with that, the film does tease a payoff to all this, and we do think we're at least going to get this big, epic showdown among all three characters by the end to make up for the first hour's worth, only for them to pull the rug from under us completely with an ending that is both anticlimactic and actually pretty mean-spirited, which was the biggest reason why I initially hated this movie so much. So, now, I think it's certainly more watchable. The performances are definitely what kept this film from being terrible for me, and there are sporadic moments of entertainment from seeing them get to do their thing, but it's still a disappointing end to this trilogy that had so much more potential. Number 9, The Village, and from here on out, these are all movies I was more positive than negative on. The one thing with The Village is that it's similar to Glass in the sense that I really hated upon my first watch, and generally for the same reason as Glass, which is that I really did not like the ending, on top of finding everything else preceding the ending to be pretty dull. But once again, upon a more recent rewatch, I've come around to it a lot more, though this is at the point where this tips into positive territory more for me. Now, it's not great. I do think that while Shyamalan sets the creepy atmosphere well with this mystery element of what lies behind this confined village, it can sometimes be a bit too somber and self-serious for its own good. And while I do really like the two central performances by Bryce Dallas Howard and Joaquin Phoenix, I do think that the very stacked supporting cast either get not a whole lot to do, as is the case for the likes of Brendan Gleeson and Sigourney Weaver, or there will be performances that don't age the best. In particular, Adrian Brody as a developmentally disabled individual, and it's a performance in particular that I found to be pretty cringeworthy. So, for every moment that I found myself really immersed in, there would sometimes be a moment not too long after that undermined it a bit, though it's not to the point of total derailing, because I think when it works, it's really solid. It's not just always consistent, if you ask me, and as far as the ending goes, I don't hate it anymore. I do think it can be a bit of a stretch, but at the very least, after getting over its sheer plausibility, I can at least commend Shyamalan here for trying to tap into themes that, as I've already mentioned, are prevalent in a lot of his other movies, like overcoming grief. So he does try to provide some emotional core with that ending and not just have it totally be a twist for the sake of a twist. I'm still a little iffy on it, but I at least get what he's going for here. Overall, this film as a whole is a bit inconsistent, but I still think there's plenty about it that works just fine. Number 8, Old. I was really mixed on this one for the first time I saw it, and I still feel mostly the same way about it this time around, though maybe just a touch more positive, now that I know what I'm in for. Now, this is another big, high-concept thriller from Shyamalan, and there are plenty of times he has fun with this premise of our lead characters rapidly aging. He leans where he can into these body horror elements and throws in bits of dark humor really nicely, which makes for some good B-movie fun. But the big thing for me is that whenever he tries tapping into any sort of character development or tried to give the story some deeper meaning, it becomes rough to get through, primarily because this actually contains some of the worst acting I've seen in any of Shyamalan's movies. The dialogue, as usual for him, can be hit and miss, and some of the cast do salvage it. I think Rufus Sewell is one of the biggest standouts for me personally. But despite a lot of really talented actors in this ensemble, a number of the core players, in particular our two leads played by Gael Garcia Bernal and Vicky Krieps, are really bad here. Like, they try going big whenever they're trying to have this heartfelt moment or this big outburst, but it just comes off as laughable as the moments that are meant to be intentionally funny. So that held this movie back for me, on top of the fact that when all is revealed about the island itself, it's not necessarily terrible, but I'd say it's a little underwhelming. Even when I knew what to expect going in the second time around, I was just like, after it. It's nothing egregious, but I was definitely expecting more. But while it didn't exactly end on the strongest note, there were still so many body horror moments from earlier on that I found to be so over the top and fun that it made up for that a little for me. And I appreciated them a little more this time around, to the point where their good just outweighs the bad. So It's another movie where it didn't quite live up to the potential it had, but at least the ride wasn't so bad. Number 7, The Happening. And I know this is going to be where I lose some people, but I gotta be honest, I think this is just a blast, and not in a so bad it's good sort of way. Now, I avoided this movie for so long because I honestly thought I was going to be in for a bad movie. But as I was getting ready to sit down with it, and I actually read what Shyamalan's intentions were, which was to make something in the vein of The Blob, and paying homage to those cheesy 50s B movies, I went into it with the mindset that all those ridiculous moments that you'd see repeatedly get made fun of in countless YouTube videos were completely intentional. And when you do that, it becomes a much, much better movie. It becomes the campy, fun B-movie that Shyamalan was intending for this to be, and not the ultra-serious thriller that it was mismarketed as. So as a result, I really enjoyed it. Now, yeah, whenever it tries having a somewhat more emotional moment, it does fall flat on its face. But overall, I think this essentially nails the campy, over-the-top B-movie tone, which was something that Shyamalan was trying to recreate with Old later on. Those somewhat more serious moments that I just mentioned a second ago that didn't work for me, those come few and far in between. And all the line deliveries, all the bizarre dialogue, all the weird setups, like the one in particular of Mark Wahlberg apologizing to a plant, those are rarely used to try driving home any sort of big, emotionally resonant sequence. They're used to get some good laughs out of us and to give us some mindless entertainment that essentially parodies those old B movies. And they work. They're just so out there that it makes for great comedic timing. If you view it with the right lens, of course. I mean, if you're going into this expecting the serious movie it was marketed as, you are going to hate it. But if you view it with the mindset that it was intentionally made as a comedy, which I sincerely do believe, you'll be in for a great time. I really think this is the most misunderstood movie in Shyamalan's filmography, and I really believe that it's worth checking out. Number 6, Split. Now, the thing with this is that this movie as a whole is good. Like all of Shyamalan's films, it's solid on a technical level, the sense of claustrophobia is maintained very nicely, Anya Taylor-Joy is a likable protagonist with a thoroughly explored backstory, and the cat and mouse elements keep you engaged, but this ultimately also relies heavily on the performance of James McAvoy, and it's him specifically that propels this into greatness. Usually having just one really strong element shouldn't be enough for a movie to be considered great, but McAvoy is on a whole other level here. If nothing else, this just gets to show the sheer range that he has, where he has to go through all these different personalities that embody our antagonists, switching between them so quickly from scene to scene, or sometimes within the same scene. And it's not even a matter of him just speaking a little differently, or he has a slightly different delivery, because even the physicality involved when he shifts gears is something to behold. It elevates the material to a whole other level, because now it just shows how much more of an interesting character he is. And even when he's not on screen, you still feel his presence looming in those moments, especially because you really don't actually know what to expect next. You don't know what personality is going to show itself in the next scene, or sometimes even within the same scene. And you don't know how reasonable or unreasonable that personality is going to be, if it's going to be to Anya Taylor-Joy's advantage or disadvantage. So that makes him that well crafted of a character, and is at the heart of what makes this such an effective thriller. Without him, you get a good movie, but one that I don't think would have ultimately been as memorable. Now, beyond that, a couple of things here and there that don't work. In particular, there's this psychologist who attempts to get through to McAvoy and this major subplot that I don't really feel added too much. I found a lot of the dialogue in those scenes to come off as kind of hokey. But beyond that, this is still one of the highlights of Shyamalan's later filmography and one of James McAvoy's finest performances. Number 5, the most recent film on this list, Knock at the Cabin, probably one of the most contained and to the point of all of Shyamalan's films, with everything taking place within the titular cabin and with all the tension stemming from this one burning question that lingers over the entire film. That being, if our protagonist will make this difficult choice that they're not even sure is entirely based in reality. No big twist, no grand reveal, it's, will this decision be made, and is this situation even real? And while some people might view that setup as being this one-trick pony, at the end of the day, it's all within the execution, and I thought it hit the nail on the head. What especially makes this interesting is the dynamic between our protagonist, played by Jonathan Groff and Ben Aldridge, and our antagonist, led by Dave Bautista. Because even though our antagonists keep the rest of the characters tied up and they're trying to force them into making this sacrifice, there's still this level of complexity to the antagonist because they don't really want to do what they're set out to do, and you even see them struggle with that as they try convincing Groff and Aldridge that they're telling the truth. And then, even though you think there's no way that they could be telling the truth, we'll then see these incidents throughout the rest of the film that call everything into question and have you just as torn as our protagonist. The performances especially help elevate that, with Dave Bautista in particular being excellent, really showcasing the pain that his character is experiencing. And you don't root for what he does, but you're still fascinated by his next step. And not even just with the antagonists. I really like Groff and Aldridge as well. I do think that some of the attempts at diving into their backstory don't ultimately add as much as I would have liked, and I do think it can kind of throw off the pacing a bit, but I like Groff. Kristen Cui, who plays the young Wen, is great, and I especially loved Aldridge, who's this great mix of heartfelt, but also commanding as he's the one primarily pushing back against Bautista. So you have a really solid cast and a unique take on the cat and mouse claustrophobic thriller, and it makes for a really engaging watch. It's all effective storytelling if you ask me, and by no means did I think did it feel one-dimensional or repetitive. Number 4, The Visit. Generally viewed as Shyamalan's comeback film after a string of so many movies failing to resonate with critics and or audiences. And as you can tell by its placement here, I'm inclined to agree with everyone that this is indeed one of his strongest movies. And maybe that's partially because I am a sucker for found footage movies. It's always been one of my favorite horror subgenres, and I think that's due to, given the style, there's an extra level of immersion that comes with it, since they're literally made to look like you're watching footage of actual people rather than something a little more stagey. So even with those movies that don't reinvent the wheel, more often than not, I'm all in, and that's the case with this. It's one of those movies that it's kind of obvious where the big reveal is going to some degree, but given the events that precede the big reveal, rather than view each sequence with eye-rolling or complaining how you can see it coming, you almost look forward to it with glee, and that's because of the tone Shyamalan sets, mixing scares with pitch-black comedy, with the increasingly unhinged behavior by the two grandparents. You'll have these moments that can elicit chills, like this really tightly shot sequence involving a chase underneath the house, and then the way it's played off after the fact, while what just happened before it, it's still unsettling, but you just can't help but laugh at the aftermath. And it walks this line nicely of cutting the tension, but not totally deflating it. And that formula just repeatedly gets cranked up as we keep going along, so that once we get to the big reveal, it just goes all out and lets loose, and it is an absolute blast from there. Again, like Knock at the Cabin, it can be pretty to the point in many regards, as opposed to the more high-concept, twisty-turny filled thrillers like Shyamalan's known for, but because of how fun it was in its execution, that more than made up for it. Number 3, The Sixth Sense, the film that effectively propelled Shyamalan into the mainstream and still has one of the most famous twist endings of all time. One that, even for most of those who still haven't seen the movie, they know it. It's to the point that, along with Haley Joel Osment's line, "I see dead people," it almost overshadows the entire rest of the movie, so that you think of almost nothing else when this comes to mind. But it should be noted that the moments that are so ingrained in pop culture aside, this is still both a great ghost story with chilling horror elements, as well as an emotional character drama. The sequences of Haley Joel Osment experiencing visions of these ghosts would often be pretty chilling, sometimes just due to Shyamalan's direction alone. But they're made even more effective by just how great Osment's performance is, bringing so much nuance to this role of someone who's capable of these extraordinary things at such an early age, and he struggles to come to terms with it, which makes for such an endearing character arc. Likewise, this sees Shyamalan tackle themes that I've made note of with several films all throughout this list, of finding some sort of meaning with your life, or repenting for past mistakes, and he does so with a real delicate touch with Bruce Willis, with his hopes that him helping Osment will help make up for one of his biggest past failures. Now I felt that it can sometimes feel a touch heavy-handed in its approach as it tackles those themes, but for the most part, it's still emotionally resonant, especially as its famous ending does lead to a very satisfying conclusion for its characters and their respective storyline. That's something that people often misconstrue about Shyamalan, that he just makes these big twists for the sake of a twist. And sometimes, yeah, they can be pretty out there, and maybe not every ending of his necessarily works, but he generally tries to go for it with a certain intent in mind, usually to add so much more emotional weight to the film, and I felt that was the case here. It wasn't just meant as a shock ending, it's still something meaningful, so that's why the film still holds up as a whole, and there's still so much more to it than just having a twist ending. It's a great supernatural thriller with plenty of memorable character moments. Our runner-up is Unbreakable, which sees Shyamalan and Bruce Willis re-team and tackle a number of similar themes from The Sixth Sense, though this time while also deconstructing the superhero genre, giving us a grounded, ultra-realistic take on those stories. And when it comes to gritty, super serious superhero movies, while I'm generally at the point now where I think I'd mostly rather see superhero movies embrace their fun side, this is still one of those films where it gets the gritty superhero subgenre right. Because it knew how to be emotionally resonant within its self-seriousness without being totally joyless, and it also knew how to be thematically rich, being almost something of this morality tale as Bruce Willis comes to accept how he's a real-life superhero and how he should be helping others, and it knew how to be all that while also not losing sight of making its characters interesting. We still found ourselves heavily invested in both David Dunn and Elijah Price, and while the movie could be pretty grim, because of just how fleshed out both characters were, no pun intended, with these unique views on the world and the way it affects their relationships, you don't really mind that it can be a bit too dour at times. And it's also just a nice showcase for both Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson to show off their range a bit more. We generally like both these actors because they come in and do a certain shtick that we'll get a kick out of, but that's not the case here. You don't see any of that. Bruce Willis isn't making wisecracks, and Samuel L. Jackson isn't cursing people out in a comedic way like we're used to. Here, we see them portray two vastly different but equally complicated individuals that require a lot more subtlety that's almost refreshing to see, as we don't always get that from either. On top of it being a pretty tense thriller where, even though we're not dealing with necessarily earth-shattering events, we'll get a number of really high-stakes situations in smaller settings. Like the sequence where Bruce Willis gets a gun pulled on him in his house by someone very unexpected still makes me anxious to this day, as do several other big moments. This is one of those movies that, with each successive watch, I appreciate it a little more, and I think it's one of the best superhero movies out there. But in first place is Signs, and this might not necessarily be the most popular opinion, at least it feels that way to me, because Signs is one of those movies that was one of the internet's movie punching bags back in the day, primarily for its third act reveal. And the funny thing is, while there have been a number of Shyamalan movies where I despise the third act on the first watch, this was never one of them. Honestly, I think you can offer a better explanation regarding the logic of this movie's third act, as opposed to some of Shyamalan's more underwhelming third acts. It never really derailed the movie for me. In fact, I really don't have that much of a problem with this movie as a whole, outside of some of the usual Shyamalan issues. Like the swing away line and its relevance to the plot was probably the only really big eye-rolling aspect of this for me personally. There's still some cringy dialogue-heavy moments, though definitely not to the extent as other Shyamalan movies. But what's funny is, despite Shyamalan working with bigger budgets for several films that came after this, I'd say this is probably his most effective outing at telling a larger scale, somewhat epic story, even though it's mostly contained to these isolated houses and fields, and the cast is mostly limited. It sees him at his most Spielberg-like, in particular feeling like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like, even though the general tone is that sense of dread, there's almost this faint sense of wonder and awe underlining it with the discovery of something much bigger out there, which is something you'd get with a lot of classic Spielberg. But I think the fact that it maintains such a larger-than-life feel, despite its limited settings, is due to the fact that even though you only see the aliens in this movie for so long, you feel their presence linger throughout this, and Shyamalan does a great job at setting this very tense atmosphere as our characters get further involved in figuring these aliens out and starting to fight back against them later on. And it gets to the point where even just a glimpse of them is enough to make the scene feel so unnerving, like the sequence with the hand under the door, or Joaquin Phoenix seeing one briefly on TV. The way we feel on edge, even from such a limited interaction, goes to show how well crafted this is. And then again, like a lot of Shyamalan's other movies, the way he incorporates these themes such as grief, the religious overtones, it just blends in nicely with the genre elements, and it leads to some great moments of character development, and we also find ourselves heavily invested in these characters, whose arcs tie in well with the alien material, rarely without it feeling like this unnecessary detour. Even if parts of it can feel a little on the uneven side, it all goes hand in hand nicely for the most part, and it leads to a very engaging mystery thriller that I still find incredibly entertaining to this day. It's another movie that I like more and more on each rewatch. It can still creep me out, and it comes in as my number one favorite M Night Shyamalan movie. But let me know, what's your ranking of M Night Shyamalan's films? Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.